A gente teve no último seminário que tivemos aqui na Light, o seminário de sustentabilidade, o BNDES apresentou alguns números. Desses, a gente viu que nos próximos 3 anos no Brasil, a gente vai ter 60% mais de investimentos do que nos últimos 3. E aí fica aquela questão, se a gente já teve problema com fornecedores nos últimos 3, você imagina nos próximos 3. Se a gente já teve problema com gente nos últimos 3, imagina nos próximos 3. Então, enfrentar esse crescimento e de forma sustentável é um desafio muito grande, principalmente para as áreas de suprimentos. E a palestra da Catherine tem tudo a ver com isso. E, mais uma vez, a gente fica muito feliz em recebê-la aqui. Então, Catherine, please. It's all yours.
Thank you. Bom dia, everyone. I'm going to try to make do with this microphone. I talk with both my hands, so I'll try to keep this close. But it's a great pleasure to be here back in my favorite country in the world, Brazil, and probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Rio de Janeiro. Now let's see if we can... So it is a distinct pleasure that I am with you today to talk about a topic that I believe is so socially significant and so culturally and geographically ubiquitous. It's a topic that is both scientifically potent and politically controversial. But I do believe that it is a topic that will be historically relevant in how we define our future. So for this morning's discussion, I'm going to be covering a myriad of converging challenges facing our planet, our communities, business and industry, certainly supply chain professionals, and indeed each and every one of us. I believe we're at a critical juncture where change is required with respect to this whole notion of sustainability. And we can either be a catalyst for change or we can be a casualty of it. But change conjures up the notion, what will you do? And for me, when I thought about the topic of climate change, carbon emissions, water and energy conservation, deforestation, population growth, in a word, sustainability, these emotional, moral, and ethical obligations to act, for me, that call to action began with a personal journey. And that personal journey began when I turned 50. For my birthday, I have 4 sisters. They're all a little crazy. They're all very competitive. And they think they are all so clever. But for my birthday, they gave me, instead of a traditional present that you unwrap, they gave me a gift you get wrapped up in. Not a present, but a goal. And that goal they gave me was the challenge to run a half marathon, 21 kilometers, 13.1 miles. And I was like, woo, happy birthday. Not. Running was not on the top of my list of things that I love to do. Actually, running wasn't on my list at all. And a birthday should be about something that you love to do. And I do love to travel. So the gift was actually not just to run a half marathon, 21 kilometers. The gift, or the goal that kept on giving, was the challenge to run a sanctioned half marathon on all 7 continents. Whew, I was delighted. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is my personal journey and the profound impact that it had on me. I want to talk about this call to action and why, in fact, the the role of the supply chain professional is so, so absolutely significant in this regard. And I'd like to just kind of reinforce why a mandate and adopting a mandate for change is so important. Not only in thinking with a sustainable mindset and adopting, even in some small ways, a sustainable lifestyle, but in thinking professionally about our business models and how we incorporate sustainability into our work plan. So continent number 1, North America, took me to Anchorage, Alaska, land of the midnight sun and the aurora borealis. An area with glaciers with this phenomenal translucent turquoise blue. But it is just these glaciers and the adjacent polar ice caps that are melting, and melting at an unprecedented rate. Spring is arriving earlier. Fall comes later. Last summer, the sea ice in the Arctic was 20% less than it was in 2005. Some scientists predict that within the next 10 to 20 years, the summer sea ice will melt away entirely, threatening the very habitat that polar bears depend on to hunt, to travel, to raise their young, and to rest. Continent number 2 took me to the land down under and a fabulous sunrise run across the harbor bridge with thousands of people making their way along Sydney Harbor, through Macquarie's Botanical Gardens, and a spectacular finish at the steps of the iconic Sydney Opera House. Australia, land of the Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest aquatic ecosystem, one of the world's 7 natural wonders, habitat for fisheries that feed over 1 billion people in Asia Pacific and beyond. And let's keep in mind, coral reefs cover only 0.5% of the world's ocean floors, yet 90% of sea life is dependent upon it. And as the Earth's atmosphere warms, so does the temperature of our oceans. As greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, so does the acidity of our seas. Today, 20% of the world's coral reefs are either bleached, killed, or damaged beyond repair. I've got to point this. Continent number 3 took me to Africa for a fabulous run on the Serengeti Plains, a run I was determined to stay in the middle of the pack. Africa and the Serengeti is not a place you want to be running in last place, looking weak and wounded and a lot like lunch. Anyway, but I did this run with my sister, and we literally and figuratively capped off our run on the Serengeti with a 7-day trek to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro, the roof of Africa and one of the world's 7 summits, standing 5,895 meters above sea level, 19,340 feet, the roof of Africa. And the snows of Kilimanjaro, made so famous in the early 1900s by the writings of Ernest Hemingway, and those snows so evident in the early 1900s. The snows and the glaciers of Mount Kilimanjaro today, 80% of them are gone. Leaving a dangerously more arid African continent. And it's not just the 900 million people on Africa, but water is an acute problem for many people around the world, and really all of us on the planet today. Let's think about this. 97.5% of all of the water on the planet is salt water. The fresh water that we get from our lakes and streams and rivers and aquifers and glaciers, 70% of that fresh water supply is found on the remote and inaccessible continent of Antarctica. The next continent took me to Beijing, China, land of the Great Wall of China, one of the 7 man-made wonders on the planet, stretching over 6,400 kilometers, over 4,000 miles, one of the few man-made structures visible from outer space. And China, picture China, 1.3 billion people, 1.3 billion people. Picture the impact of such cumulative aspiration. Picture the power of 1.3 billion people and such collective inspiration. And let's consider the consequences. A continent that once ran on 2 wheels now runs on 4. Car ownership in China has quadrupled over the last decade and shows no signs of abating. It is predicted by the year 2015 there will be 1.2 billion cars on this planet, 1 for every 6 people. So consider, as developing nations, and understandably, desire to own the automobile and acquire the car and require the fuel and congest more roads and emit more pollution, the consequences for all of us that share this earth are significant. Continent number 5 took me to a beautiful, flat, cool, and fast run. Well, fast may be giving me too much credit. Speed is relative, but a beautiful run along the canals of Amsterdam. The Dutch, early adopters of renewable energy. For centuries, they've used windmills to pump water out of a country whose 70% of their land lies beneath sea level. Amsterdam, a city in the Netherlands, a country that would be further and significantly threatened by any rise in sea level. And keep in mind, for every 2.5 centimeters or about 1 inch of rise in sea level, there is a corresponding 2.5 meters of approximate coastal erosion. With 70% of the world covered by oceans and seas, it should come as no surprise that even today, we have almost 200 million people living in areas exposed to sea level rise. 29 of our largest cities live in areas that are exposed. From Tokyo to Hong Kong to Alexandria, Egypt, to London and New York and Buenos Aires, New Orleans. It is projected that by the year 2100, 1 billion people, billion people on this planet, if they don't move, will be in areas threatened and in harm's way as a result of the continued rise in sea level. Continent number 6 brought me here to Brazil, home to the world's largest tropical rainforest, the Amazon. Tropical rainforests, so important to the health and vitality of our planet. And the Amazon, the largest of the tropical rainforests, representing over half. And rainforests, which today only cover about 10% of the Earth's surface. But think about this. Tropical rainforests, those lush, carbon-cleansing lungs of our planet, every day they are scrubbing out 15% of man-made carbon emissions. Tropical rainforests, every day pumping into the atmosphere 20 billion tons of moisture that help water the world's crops. Tropical rainforests, our planet's gene pool, responsible for anywhere from half to 80% of all the plant and animal species found on the planet today. But we are losing these tropical rainforests at an unprecedented rate due to deforestation, for cattle grazing, commercial agriculture, logging, colonization. In fact, the Amazon, which once was home to over 6 million indigenous people, is now home to less than 250,000. We are losing 100 acres every single minute. That's the size of England every single year. And this is a really difficult problem because on one hand you have developed nations with their desire for more soy, more beef, exotic timber, palm oil, and developing nations desire to improve economically. It is a very delicate balance and a difficult area. And those of you in supply chain, as you work on sustainable sourcing, will be faced with these dilemmas every day in your job. And last but not least, Antarctica, the coldest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. A continent phenomenal by any descriptions, and words fall far short to being able to describe its beauty. And a person cannot help but feel very small and inconsequential against a backdrop of such grandeur. But I can assure you we are anything but inconsequential. Temperatures in Antarctica are on the rise. The continent is actually 4.5 degrees, which is significant, warmer now than it was 50 years ago. And this warming is having a very chilling effect. Because as the atmosphere and the oceans warm, that sea ice melts. And krill, that briny crustacean that is such a main food source for so much of the marine life in the Antarctic region, krill larva feeds on the algae that accumulates on the underside of the sea ice. With less sea ice, there's less algae. With less algae, the krill population has declined. The krill population is now 80% less than it was in 1980. The Adelaide penguin, shown here, which feeds on the krill, has seen a similar population decline, 50% over the same period. And the leopard seal that feeds on the penguin, and so on and so forth. So you're probably asking or wondering, where is Kathy going with this long story? Well, this is my long segue. My daughters would say I ramble, I probably do. But it is my long segue into the food chain, like the supply chain, is in a very, very delicate balance. And as we affect one aspect of it, we in fact affect the entire chain. So each of us need to adopt this notion of becoming more of a planetary steward. And those of us as supply chain professionals absolutely have never had a more challenging time in our career, a more critical time in our career as our companies depend upon us, nor a more complex time to deal with the strategic sourcing challenges that we face. So I was very, very fortunate, very blessed to have this personal opportunity, this unique birthday gift that gave me the chance to see, to feel, to experience the consequences of our lifestyle of abundant consumption. It gave me a chance to better understand the ramifications of the continued growth in the world's population. It gave me the opportunity to really think about this and deal with the proverbial elephant in the room before that elephant became extinct. So let's keep in mind, from 1960 to 1999, the world's population doubled. It went from 3 billion to 6 billion in less than 50 years. That is unprecedented. The population is expected to grow to 10 billion by 2050, with 90% of that growth occurring in developing nations. Electronic waste is the fastest growing and most hazardous waste stream in the world today. There are over 4 billion people on the planet with cell phones. Over 100 million are disposed of each year, and not all in ecologically sound fashion. In fact, in the US, less than half the companies have formal product disposal programs in place to help address these types of problems. Today, 1 out of every 6 people on the planet does not have access to fresh water or decent sanitation. That number, by the year 2050, when the planet's population approaches 10 billion, is expected to be 50%. The challenges we face due to water shortages are extreme and will only continue to get more significant. 95% of cities today around the world still dump their raw sewage into their waterways. And last but not least, biodiversity. Biodiversity that is so very important for the health and vitality of our planet. Today, the extinction rate is pacing out at 100 to 1,000 times faster than it has in the last 65 million years. 65 million years ago, the last time we had a mass extinction. But 65 million years ago, it was catastrophic volcanic eruption or a meteor strike. Today, it is directly due to the impact of the human population and encroachment into these very sensitive biodiversity areas. So let's think about this, because we are a planet under stress. We are a planet under stress. If 200 years ago, we could have looked down at planet Earth, you would have seen 2 points of light. 2 points of light, 2 cities with over 1 million people. Today, there are 450 such points of light. 450 cities on the planet with populations over 1 million people, and we are adding the equivalent of 7 New York cities every single year. In 1900, only 13% of the world's population lived in cities or urban areas. In 2008, for the first time in the history of the world, over half of the population on the planet now lives in urban areas. And that number is expected only to increase. So when you think about how we deliver energy, water, education, health services, when you consider transportation and the challenges, the social, the environmental, the economic ramifications are enormous. Let's take energy for starters. In the US, our energy system for the last century was a symbol of pride and our progress. But we designed it at a time when energy was abundant, relatively cheap, and the environment was not a concern. These times have changed. Energy demand is expected to double in the next 20 years. And today, only 30% of the energy that is actually transmitted through the lines actually ever reaches the end customer for productive use. We cannot continue our pattern of abundant and unrestricted consumption. We need to be more effective. We need to be more efficient. We need to consider renewable sources and move to a smart power grid. We must be power wise as opposed to power hungry. And while we're on the topic of appetite, how do we put food on the table these days? We used to rely on local farmers and ate fresh fruits and vegetables. Today, we rely on a complex global network of fisheries, farmers, packers, manufacturers, and retailers. Countries that once seemed distant now are our primary sources of our food supply. And not all the countries that food is brought in from have consistent levels of quality, process control, and traceability. In the US alone, we have over 76 million cases of foodborne illness each year. We import 60% of our fruits and vegetables. We import 75% of our seafood. We inspect less than 1%. We need a reliable way to track and trace food from farm to fork. And think about this. Developed nations, we have come to expect access to seasonal fruits and vegetables 365 days a year. And yet 30% of all the food that we purchase goes to waste, while much of the world still struggles with hunger. And traffic and logistics, a topic that's probably near and dear to many of your heart when you think about how you buy, how you supply. I love this slide in this weird way. This is a picture of a intersection in New York City. It's estimated that 45% of the traffic in New York City on the busiest streets is people circling the block looking for parking. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure to drive in Sao Paulo, Beijing, New Delhi, Mumbai, Cairo, or Nairobi. It's crazy. I just came from Nairobi and I had to cross town, and I had asked the taxi driver, about how long will it take us to get to the destination? Oh, about 45 minutes, traffic permitting. 4 hours later. This went on every day. I would say, about how long will it take to get to this destination? Oh, 45 minutes to an hour, traffic permitting. Well, when these taxi drivers were getting their taxi certificate 5-7 years ago, it did take 45 minutes to cross town. Today, it takes 4 hours. And as we look at the continued migration into cities, as we look at how we will deliver goods and services, as we look at the productivity loss and the associated cost of traffic